In this video, we're going to be focusing on a quick tip to create what looks like condensation on objects in a photo. So originally this photo of some tomatoes doesn't have that effect applied, but go ahead and add something of that case that looks like water droplets from a real life scenario. So after maybe washing these or some rain maybe fell on something, it might look similar to this. Obviously, if you zoom in real close, you can see it's probably not realistic as what original water would actually look like, but from a distance, these effects can be applied to a photo and actually kind of just give it a little more depth. So the same is true for the Coke can you might see on this image here. So if I were to remove that layer, you just see a basic can that's just, the infamous red color of Coca-Cola. But if we add just some texture and some layers of this shape that we created, you can see the difference. And although it isn't quite 100% real, it does do the effect we're after. So this video will be focusing on that. We'll be taking these images, adding these elements, and seeing what we can do. But if you notice in the very background here, I did some blur adjustments here just to kind of promote that look and feel across the whole spectrum, but also make it look like there's some depth to this photo too. So it's all in the details. So let's kick things off. In the start folder, you'll find the tomatoes, which we can just open by going File, Open, and then I'll navigate to that folder. These photos here, you can go ahead and grab. So I'm gonna just open both of those for now, and we'll save them down as different file names in the end. So Affinity Photo, we'll save it in our folder on the in folder, and I'll save this as Coke or tomatoes. Okay, so with these ready to roll, we can go ahead and start creating this look. So you won't really touch the base layer that much. We already got it fairly edited. It's already a nice looking photo, but we want to just add some more things to it. So to do that, I'm going to use a ellipsis tool to create our initial shape that we're after. And then this is going to look just like a circle to start with. And from that, we'll definitely decrease the opacity quite a bit. It's like 20%. And then the bulk of the look of this effect is going to be a gradient overlay. So we'll kind of just grab the gradient tool and adjust the colors on it. I'm going to go pretty dark and then all the way light, just from top to bottom on the gradient. So we can adjust the handles here accordingly. If we look at our reference, you'll see there's a few elements to each drop, and the overlying factor is that it's just this bubble looking effect, so it's embossed. And then we have this accent on the bubble itself that kind of is what the original light source is shining into. So from a distance, you'll notice not so much details, but from close up, you'll see that these have little gradients, little shadows, and emboss treatments. So we'll go ahead and add those. So I'm going to possibly go this direction, kind of towards this light source. We can get clues that the light source is coming from this direction by the actual light in the image. So the whitest whites are going to be where the light source is directed from. So that's where you want to focus all of your lighter colors to create the most realistic effect. So from here we can go and probably add a blend mode to kind of just give this the effect we're after, or maybe luminosity. We'll start there. And I'm going to add layer effects, and the first one's going to be an emboss, so bevel and emboss. And we're going to use emboss as the type and increase the radius quite a bit. And the direction, we can probably use this as our indication of the direction, but I want to use a color that's relative to our image. So I'm going to pick a color from the reds and maybe go pretty dark with that. And we can decrease that radius a bit. It's awfully massive in this scenario, so we just want it to have some effect, and then we could soften that, of course. And you could toy around with this in any which way you want. We might do a different effect, maybe see what pillow looks like. Emboss outer. I think emboss is probably the best bet. And soften, you can toy with however you need to. And then I want to add a inner glow. That's going to be a white glow. So something like this to kind of promote that look. And that's going to be set on the edge. So you kind of just use the default settings here and just increase the radius so it looks pretty decent. One extra layer I want to add to each of these is another accent focal point of the droplet. So this is going to be just kind of a gradient based shape that will extend to use similar styles that we're already using, but I'm going to decrease the opacity quite a bit. So like, I don't know, 40. It needs to be the brightest bit of the drop though, so we want it to be pretty high. And then we can adjust. I think I'll decrease this gradient to be more of a white than a black, something like so. And this one needs to be awfully bright. So instead of the whole layer opacity, I might increase it all the way, and then on the gradient itself, decrease this gray opacity independently. So maybe like 35% here. And there is our first droplet. So that's kind of the effect I'm after. We have some more shaded areas in this particular piece. So you'll notice the shadows inset towards the actual drop, and that makes more sense in this case. So let's try to do that with our effects and adjust that a bit. So the embossment, I actually want to be the opposite direction where it was before. And then I think multiply, we want to make this a little darker than it was, and probably decrease the radius some, something like so. And if you want to adjust the profile, this is just the way that curve is rendered. So here's how that shadow might look in different scenarios, different profiles. I kind of like this bubble look on the edge, kind of rounds to the shape we're after. And if you want to get a little more refined there, you can. Feel free to experiment with blend modes too. I think multiply is going to be your best bet in this scenario. So once we have this initially set up, we can go ahead and just duplicate these shapes across our composition, and it's ultimately going to make it look like condensation's coming from the whole area. You can do a little bit of outer shadow to kind of give some depth so that it looks like it's sitting on top of the shape itself, maybe some offset to it. Decrease that opacity a bit. So something like that I think could roll and be decent. So from afar it looks pretty decent to me. This perfect circle shape is obviously not realistic to the real life quality of a water droplet, but you can feel free to edit those either by just grouping these and skewing them a bit, maybe pulling them sideways or contorting them, even scaling them like this. Or if you want, you can make the ellipse itself. Right now it's got things you can do outside of the spectrum of a curve. So if you want it to be a curve, you can just hit convert to curves, and at that point you can double click the shape and edit the path. So ultimately you can make this exactly how you want it to look just by dragging from different areas on the shape and contorting things. You can also add points to the path by double clicking on the line if you want. The less points you have, the more, I would say, subtle the shape looks in terms of roundness. So keep that in mind as you're making more points or adding points to composition. Less is more, as is with anything, so keep that in mind. But from here we can just pick and choose from these and maybe just plot them at random points around the actual photo. And you spread them out. Where I would focus is any crevices that you think water would actually end up when it dropped on, say, the tomato, for instance. That would make more sense for maybe the shape to be up here in this little crevice there, or even underneath like this leaf area or the stem area. And if you wanted to make it even realistic, like say behind that stem, we can mask this out and grab a brush and increase the opacity. We'll go to our color, make sure we're on black, and you could just paint away that droplet very subtly to make it look like it's behind. So something like that. And then we can just continue on. I'll duplicate these, make this look as good as we can, and then circle back. Okay, so with some of these sprinkled in, we can go ahead and tweak them as a group. Realistically, they're awfully sharp in the photo, so I think what we can do is either decrease the opacity just a tad, maybe 10%, which should add a little more realness to it, or you can even go and add a layer effect of Gaussian blur to the whole group, and maybe just 1.1 pixel just to give it a little more fuzziness in the sense of this composition, because we're dealing with depth, and the way this is shot, this central tomato is actually focused and the others are actually blurred out. So it's one of those perspective based pieces. And within that, you can just sprinkle these in that look, I would say, more realistic than anything. Like, don't go overboard with where these are and their size and their positioning, but you can just kind of tweak and adjust to a position that looks, I would say, realistic from maybe this point of view. Obviously, zooming in on this photo, you can see that they're not 100% realistic drops, but they're very close. So what we can do at this point is cheat and duplicate that group and just move it over to other tomatoes and the composition, and maybe pick and choose some to save, but mostly delete quite a few of these because we don't need them all in each other tomato, because we want the central one to be more the focus. So for this one in particular, you notice the tomato itself is pretty blurred out. So I want to actually do the same with the drops, and we'll increase that blur that we've added quite a bit. So something like that. And if you were to preserve alpha here, it's going to override and show a little more clearness of those. So definitely, I would say uncheck that box, but you can experiment. So we can duplicate this and just go to town on the other tomatoes in the composition as well. Feel free to just change this up though to vary the way they look across each shape. Ultimately, you can be kind of lazy with it because it's going to be very scattered in the sense of, you know, there's no perfect way these drops end up making it on every tomato each time. So it's going to be one of those things you can kind of get away with. So we'll just add a few more and call it good. On this particular tomato as well, I might decrease the opacity a little more. I don't want them so clear, but I do want them to be present, and maybe we'll remove a couple. And where you see creases is where I would focus on adding drops. So creases or bevels in an object is going to be where water tends to kind of just live. So I think focusing in on those will make this look even more realistic. Remove that one there. You just add those sporadically. You create that one initial shape and then just kind of contort it from there. But yeah, that's essentially it. This is the look and feel of what the tomatoes would look like. So we can do the same kind of process, and I'll actually steal some of these for the Coke can in the end. And these are going to be more focused and concentrated. So we're focusing on real condensation in this image. So the light source, as you can see, the lightest part is coming from about up to the top right in this photo. So I kind of want these, the highlight or accent in each bubble, to point that direction. That makes the most sense in this case. So from here we can just group and try your best to not overlap them as much as possible so it's really realistic. But you can just kind of contort and do some adjustments along the way, just sprinkling these in. So I'll do that and then we'll round this out. Okay, so I'm finished up there. You'll notice there's some droplets just trailing off to the side here. I actually want to do some work on those. And what I'll end up doing is just making a mask on that group and painting out those areas I don't want to have. And that's a quick win to get those still in the image, but just look like they are actually on the Coke can. So there you have it. We could go and continue on this path and just continually duplicate layers. Up to you if you want to follow along and just kind of find objects and do the same pattern. Feel free. You can go to town here, but ultimately we're initially creating a simple droplet shape and duplicating it randomly, and then adding it to our composition that makes it just a little more realistic in case of making the water effect a little more prominent. So oftentimes you might see in marketing commercials or stunts or something like that where a object that is being marketed is actually has a similar treatment to it. It makes it a little more compelling to go purchase. Those little commercial patterns that you see on these ads that you might see in the wild, you know, make something a little more compelling, like food shots or stuff like that. It's just going the extra mile to make it sell to the consumer. Anyway, that's essentially it. So feel free to tweak this on your own and add this concept to any of your photos. I would love to see what you come up with. If you want to share, feel free to put those in the comments below. Other than that, thank you for watching.